Hello, Elena.
Hello, Helen.
Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too. So, I thought to begin our walk and talk today in a garden. It is the Nicosia Municipal Garden, and it was initially conceived during the British colonial rule in Cyprus. So the sum that was reserved in order to buy and install a clock in a public square in memory of Queen Victoria, who had just died, it was then used to buy this plot of land, which was then developed into a garden. And I was thinking that gardens link with notions of commemoration and remembrance, and it is this link that I want to make with your work, which deals with memory and remembering, as in if piecing its disjointed parts together. And I'm thinking, of course, works such as Fragment and Trace, and then other works that sort of comprise a trilogy, such as Memory Theatre and more recently Perpetuum Mobile. And I wanted to ask about the thinking behind these works.
Well, I think they have gradually evolved, really, from the time when I first started thinking about Fragment and Trace, which is the first one. Mm-hmm. And in Fragment and Trace, I think the emphasis was very much on a kind of expression of mourning as keening, doing some sort of repetitive, pointless kind of, as if banging your head against a wall or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I started doing what I would call rather absurd, futile activities, like banging stones against rocks, measuring the ground with units, with measuring sticks which had no units of measurement, and so on and so on. Yes, I mean so the emphasis in Fragment and Trace was really about the absurd activities as a form of keening and trying to find some sort of visual expression for the concept of mourning. Mm-hmm. The emphasis very much on doing things like that. That continued, those sorts of activities continued, I think, perhaps in their most absurd manifestation in Memory Theatre, which is the second of the trilogy, in which I attempt to measure the sea with buckets and also to empty the sea. And obviously that's a kind of Sisyphean task where you just go on and on repeating, and you are obviously bound to fail in the task because it'll never be completed. And that ties in perhaps a little bit with my thinking about Schlegel and the concept of the philosophical fragment, which I'll perhaps talk about a little bit more later on. Mm-hmm. But for me also something to do with journeying as a metaphor for loss, well, as a metaphor for mourning, really, and memory, started to become, I knew it was underlying my thinking all along, and it's evident a little bit in Fragment and Trace and Memory Theatre, but it came much more to the fore in Perpetuum Mobile, mm-hmm. which is almost entirely to do with walking. And the idea of walking, the idea of, in a sense, being condemned to walk forever the earth, not ever actually going anywhere. But at the same time, there is a sense, I believe psychologists have done some work in sort of the theory of mourning, which is to some extent to do with a kind of endless searching, mm-hmm. and just forever searching, but not ever finding what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, for Perpetuum Mobile, I'm very interested in Simon Critchley's thinking, the philosopher Simon Critchley's thinking, and his book Memory Theatre, which underpins a lot of he has inspired a lot of my thinking around my work. And in his book Memory Theatre, he notes he especially underlines the fact that Hegel he emphasizes Hegel's insight into the notion that memory, rather than being some kind of dull recitation of the past, is in fact endlessly reinventing itself and is a kind of perpetuum mobile and a kind of endlessly recreating and reenacting loop. So that's where I've got with the trilogy. That's as far as I've got, you know. I hope that answers to some extent.
Yeah, and this brings me to my second question, because indeed in your text, in explaining your work, you do turn to Simon Critchley's memory theatre, who, as you've said, he's also referencing Hegel's notions on memory, and also especially memory theatre as a kind of mnemotechnic system developed since antiquity.
Yes.
In order to store and retrieve knowledge. And I wanted to ask whether you sort of approach your work as a kind of idiosyncratic mnemotechnic system for retrieving and storing memories. Whether you...
I think immediately my answer would probably be no, except that I think it is becoming that. I think it is becoming more that. And I am more conscious of the fact, because I work in a very intuitive way, even in the editing. But I think what I'm possibly doing is a kind of bricolage, a kind of collecting bits here, bits there, and somehow putting them together to the so-called final piece. And I'm beginning to edge. I think you've touched on something that I'm heading towards, which is more, and I've actually been thinking here in Cyprus, funnily enough. My goddaughter took me to the hammam the other day, which is a great place for thinking. And I started to think a lot on those lines, yes. Literally here in the last couple of days. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Now, in your search to develop a visual language for memory, loss, aloneness, mourning, you turn to the moving image. And I was thinking, what is it in the moving image that makes it sort of appropriate for such kind of work?
Yes. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I think it's very, very difficult to find a visual language for these concepts. But I think the thing about moving image, it's that kind of immediacy. It gets you. So does music. So does many other art forms. But I think in a way. It's something to do with immediacy, but also something to do with the fact that the moving image is itself moving. It's almost. I think it was Proust who talked about journeying as being a bit like sitting in a railway carriage, like being in a film, and you see the countryside frame by frame by frame by frame, and in a way, for me, because memory and mourning are so difficult to visualize and to conjure up visually. I'm always struggling to find this sort of bricolage, frame by frame thing going on. And I think it's to do with moving, and to do with sound, because I think sound evokes. A certain mood, and of course I'm very lucky to be able to work with Tom Lane, the composer who creates the soundscapes for my work.
I was thinking that yes, the slow pace in your videos, but also these repetitive acts that we watch, and also the long takes on landscapes and features do create this very highly evocative sort of atmosphere in your pieces, which is accentuated, I find, with the use of sound.
Yes.
And I was also wondering about that relationship between image and sound in your work, and that very careful balance.
Well, I think that's very much, and I think Tom is to be credited very much there, because what I do is I create, probably say the rough cut, shall we say, first. At that point in the work, I will normally send to Tom the first cut basically of the piece, and I will normally say to him, I think I would like it. I normally say I would like the sound to be very Spartan and conceptual, not sort of cinematic and beautiful in itself. And I think he does make it quite lyrical in any case, but I think I think he does get it. He's very good, for me, I don't know if other people would agree, at kind of understanding what's going on and creating an appropriate dimension to the work. Yeah.
To the work.
Yeah.
So walking is a very central act and theme in your work. Do you understand it as a way to call up memory through unexpected encounters with things and sensations?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. I think it's about it's slightly about, if you think of how Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden and they were sort of condemned. So in a way it's a sort of penance. It's not a process of discovery or knowing the world in any sort of focused way. Obviously, when you walk, you touch the ground, and it's the haptic element of it is really important. The feet on the ground, but in a certain sense, it's a kind of suffering, in the sense that it is unavoidable and it's endless. So I think that's what I'm trying to evoke, and that's
that idea of repetition.
Yeah. And in a
Mm-hmm.
sense goes back to the idea of the absurd activities, cutting a pomegranate or whatever, and in a sense this walking isn't going anywhere. Well, certainly not in any tangible sense. There's no end goal. You're just going around the earth in circles forever. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
So when I was preparing for this interview, I was looking a bit into the history of walking and how it relates to all these male philosophers and thinkers and painters such as Thoreau and Rousseau and Friedrich. And these men were all great walkers and journeymen, and they were guided by this conception that outside in the open space, in the landscape, one can discover one's true self. This true self was often a male self. And I was wondering, how do we unsettle these perspectives, and how does your work introduce the female experience in walking, in the practice of walking?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, so I absolutely. The male walk, certainly in the 19th century, was so much about self-knowledge, self-discovery, and in a certain sense, a sort of colonizing the earth as well, striding and walking, and female element. I don't know. I think maybe it's purposelessness. For me, purposelessness is purposeful, and maybe that's I'm a bit wary of assigning this to any particular gender. But if, insofar as I'm thinking of it from a female point of view, maybe that's what's going on, and would distinguish it certainly from those very egocentric male philosophers, wonderful philosophers, but coming from a different place to where I come from. And I suppose as well, for me, it's not about thinking grand ideas or coming to great insights or anything like that at all. And it's not about self-improvement, self-knowledge. It is very prosaic. It's just the doing, purposelessly. And I mean, in a certain sense, I mean, it has been suggested to me that my work is nihilistic because of that. And depending on, of course, how you define nihilism and where you're coming from in that sort of genre of thinking, but I do think perhaps there is a core of nihilism in my thinking, yes. That sense that I think is it in Macbeth where Macbeth sort of says, you know, sound and fury signifying nothing, or something along those lines. I forget the quote now.
I was thinking that the rituals you initiate in your work, this as form of performances, do sort of call upon the female experience, you know, and they're often futile and repetitive, like measuring seawater with buckets or pebbles next to a seashore, which of course link with processes of mourning. And of course women have been central into rituals of mourning since antiquity.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we can also perhaps bring into the discussion witchcraft,
Yes.
which you can, through which they were trying to call upon the dead and bring them back
Yes,
to life.
yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. They were sort of the conduits, weren't they, for the expression, the expressiveness of mourning, and also, as you say, sometimes through witchcraft and notions of connections with the other side and all that sort of thing. Women are supposed to, in some cultures anyway, have a special kind of intuition and special somehow skills, which are to some extent revered and respected, and in other senses very much feared, that women should have that kind of power. Yeah. Yes. And as you say, that brings one to the concept of witches, who of course people were, as a general rule, scared of, and they were viciously punished for being so. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my favorite books on walking is Rebecca Solnit's Wanderlust,
Yes.
in which she explains at some moment that walking is our kind of consummation of our relationship with the landscape.
Yes.
And I was thinking this in relation to your work, and for example, Perpetuum mobile, in which you decided to visit places such as the ancient forests of Lebanon and then places in Uzbekistan. And I was wondering about what you are actually looking for when you're choosing a landscape or location. And
yes, I wish I knew myself. I mean, to be honest, it's very intuitive, really. I mean, the cedar forests of Lebanon have an iconic relationship to the concept of mourning and death, and so in that sense, they would be an obvious reference point. In Uzbekistan and Central Asia, I, for some reason, have always had an affinity with that part of the world, and I think especially because of the Soviet rule in that region, for us, from a non-Soviet world, it was a bit of a non-space in a certain way, and now that it's these post-Soviet republics are still massively struggling in terms of who they are and what their identity, and so on and so on. But then underlying that, of course, I mean, going through those regions are the iconic Silk routes. So so they've been sites for movements of cultures, ideas, thinking, exchanges of connections and disconnections for, since time immemorial. As indeed have many other paths across, no doubt, Cyprus and, all over Europe as well. But those Silk routes are particularly sort of iconic, I think, in our imaginations because of their length, literally their length, scale of ambition in a way, as to what, how they were carrying so much in the way of tangible goods, but also in terms of ideas and cultures, exchange of cultures.
My next question relates more with how you work. Do you arrive at a location having preconceived ideas, or do you respond spontaneously to things that are around you? How do you go about developing?
Generally speaking, it's very spontaneous. The degree of spontaneity varies. And this goes back in a sense a little bit to location as well. So for example, when I have filmed in the west of Ireland, which again I try to find landscapes which are sparse, not picturesque in the sort of beautiful, I try to think beyond the picturesque when it comes to landscape. It's more about a mood and a feeling of a place rather than how it looks in a sort of picture postcard way. When we went to the west of Ireland, that was tricky because it so happened it was a very hot week. Ireland is normally shrouded in mist and rain, and there we have this beautiful. So the landscape looks so pretty, which is not what we were looking for. But then one has to sort of, I go to a particular place. For example, there was a turf bog. And I just think, well, what am I going to do here? And I started sort of scrabbling at the face of the turf, where they cut the turf. And then I just go into this thing of doing it. And it's totally intuitive. It's very difficult for the person who's filming me because they don't quite know what's going to happen next. I mean, Simon is normally my cinematographer, Simon Prujak, and it's very, very good working with him because he's very flexible and tolerant of that way of working. There's no script, there's no more storyboard, there's nothing in advance. We just go somewhere. And then I decide what to do. With the buckets and the sea, I already knew that's what I wanted to do, so I had my buckets and so on ready to do that. But often in a place, I literally decide in the moment what I'm going to do. I recently did a small piece of work which will be shown much later this year in a forest near Canterbury, and I just kind of lay on the ground and I was scrabbling at the ground and so on. It was just what felt right to do at the time. So that's how I work, yeah, usually.
So we're now going to cross the road to the riverbank. So we're walking along the bank of Bedieus River, which is actually not a river, it's a torrent. So it wells up in winter and it dries up during summertime. And there is a separate saying which I find quite interesting because it refers to this cyclical life of the river. And it says, meaning that even 1,000 years pass, the river claims its share. And I was reminded of this in relation to your work because it speaks of the ability of water to retain memory, and a lot of your rituals occur next to water. And it made me think of that, of water's relation with memory.
Yes, I mean water is such a sort of primeval archetypal entity, isn't it? And I mean, I think this particular river, when you say it's a torrent and then it dries up and then it's a torrent and it dries up, but it just keeps going on and on and on, doing its thing. And in a certain sense, maybe that's what the person in my videos is doing. Because I perhaps should have stressed that the person, it's not me personally, it's just especially I think it's obvious in Fragment and Trace more, that you see sort of a dot in the landscape doing the walking. It's not meant to identify me as such. Sounds perhaps a little bit, well, I hope it doesn't sound sort of grandiose, but the person sort of is meant to stand in for the archetypal person who just does their thing over and over and over again, a bit like the river. Relentlessly. Some sort of inexorability about it. It's just inexorable like a glacier. Just keeps moving slowly, 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 doing its thing. Yeah.
And to conclude, as a last question, would like to talk a bit about your next project, what you're currently working on.
I suppose there are probably two dimensions, two come immediately to mind. One is that with this trilogy, the 3 videos I've made, I'm always thinking about how to, in a sense, recreate them or reconsider how to do them better, basically. Simple as that, maybe bringing in other dimensions, other elements into the frame, as it were. So that's one strand. And the other one that springs immediately to mind is that I've always been very interested in spatial relationships. And when I did my MA at Middlesex, that was really more about sort of representing space, changing perceptions of space and so on. And I have done a number of what I call performance experiments, which are more multimedia in their manifestation. So there will be live performance, video, sound and so on, as almost not exactly as theatre, but as a sort of moving presentation activity, live activity. And so I'm at the moment, I in particular did a project at the Space Theatre in Space Project Space in London, in the Isle of Dogs, about 2 years ago on those lines. And I'm now revisiting that project with a view to elaborating that way of presenting, thinking about my ideas. Yeah. So I suppose again it's all about exploring the language, really trying to find a language, in terms of paying, because with obviously with something like a 3-screen video installation, it's very classical in a sense. You've got your 3 screens, you've got your rectangular space. Okay, it's got its soundscape, and it's immersive in that sense. But I think I want to just open it up a bit and not have it quite so hermetically sealed as the experience of a multi-channel, especially something like a 3-channel video installation. It is completely immersive. But it doesn't really allow it's not porous. There aren't other things going on, other distractions in a certain sense, or little punctuation marks and other things going on. And I think I would like to explore how one might do that more. It's starting with the project I did in the Space Theatre, which had, I think, about 7 projections in different ways, on screens and projected and different scales and so on and so on, to just kind of loosen it up a little bit from the sort of conventional, perhaps one would say, way of presenting video material. I mean, obviously, artists like Isaac Julian, for example, has developed the ways of presenting video work with multi-screens and so on in the most amazing way. And I'm hugely I'm a huge fan of John O'Comfort as well, who is more classical, and he usually has the 3 screens or screens in a row But for me, I'd like to introduce other elements, like literally live performance, live mark making, material, objects, for example, and so on and so on, to explore to experiment with exploring the visual language. So for me, it's always about experimentation and trying things out. So that's what I'm going to try out next.
Well, Helen, I would like to thank you for this wonderful discussion and exchange and walk.
Well, Elena, it's been a very great pleasure. Thank you very, very much for coming with me and for asking such interesting questions. It's been wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.